Welcome to the Peace Talk, this time with the German physician, peace researcher and co-founder of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, Jürgen Altmann. Jürgen Altmann is a researcher at the TU Dortmund in Germany. He is the co-founder and the chair of the German Research Association for Science, Disarmament and International Security, short FONAS. He taught and still teaches about the relationship of natural science, armament and disarmament, and has authored chapters and corresponding textbooks. He also published an article on the current geopolitical tensions between the US and Russia. Dear Mr. Altmann, I'm very glad and honored that you followed my invitation for this talk.
Hello, good afternoon. A slight correction, I'm not a physician, which is the medical profession, I'm a physicist. The word is very similar, but it's physics and not medicine that I'm involved with, and peace research, as you said.
Okay, thank you for the corrections. Let me start with my first question. What made you decide to study physics?
Well, it was kind of inherited. My father was a physics teacher at a gymnasium, at a high school in Germany. And already as a child before going to school, when he prepared the experiments for the next day, I, from time to time, accompanied him when my mother wanted some spare time for herself or for my sister and brother. So I got used to all kinds of mechanical and electrical physics equipment as a child. But then in school, primary school, less so, but then in high school, it was fairly easy for me to follow in physics and mathematics. So kind of naturally, I evolved into the interest in studying physics when I had my Abitur, my high school exam. And I studied then physics, and was all the time I found it satisfying and no reason for regret.
Okay, I understand. And did you have any academic role models?
Well, let's see. Of course, famous figures such as Einstein have motivated many people, and but of course, on the other hand, normal physics students are far off from that level of genius, if you wish. So it was rather an abstract idea, I think. I had no specific role models that I wanted to follow, no.
Okay, and where does your interest in peace and security research come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was a kind of a students' movement together with some other progressive movements throughout Western societies, at least in the 60s. And so there was a growing interest in not looking at just natural law or what they mean for technology, but also how about the use of the results of our science. Can they be used for bad purposes, not just for good ones, as the physics professors normally wanted to and did stress? So there was a general interest in being a bit critical of society and in particular of technology and its use. This was not so much about military aspects, a little, yes. For instance, I recall a situation when, what was his name, just a moment, Victor Weisskopf, one important physicist from the US Manhattan Project, he visited the physics department at the University of Hamburg, where I studied. And of course, he talked about some physics aspects, but then the students in the audience, when there was a question and answer session, asked him about nuclear weapons and what physicists should do about them. And that gave him an opportunity to expressly state that nuclear weapons are dangerous and that scientists have a special responsibility in dealing about their disarmament. So this already played a certain role, but it wasn't dominant. And then later in my doctoral thesis, I tried to do something relevant for the environment. I found a position, a fellowship, where I should work on laser radar to measure the concentration of certain toxic gases in the atmosphere at a distance, let's say a few kilometers. Unfortunately, this special laser type that we had looked for and that I did the experiments with turned out as not useful for exactly that purpose. But then later, after my dissertation was finished, they changed to other laser types and were quite successful in detecting sulfur dioxide and other toxic trace molecules in the atmosphere. So that was rather about the environment. And then came the big discussion about nuclear energy and what about final repositories and safety or not so much safety of nuclear power stations and other nuclear energy installations, where I became somewhat active. Of course, here the approach from a physics perspective is, of course, fairly useful, and this could help many engaged citizens in better understanding why they might have a reason to protest for this and that installation that was being planned in their vicinity. And then when I had my dissertation finished, I looked for a 5-year job, and a nice one was offered at the University of Marburg in the physics department in some interdisciplinary project work to do with understanding the visual systems of mammals. And I did some computer simulations somewhat well related to how the mapping from the retina of the human eye and also of the eye of other mammals like the cat and so on is mapped to the visual cortex, the brain part that processes visual input. And when those 5 years came to an end, or no, I should start again. During these 5 years, there was a big peace movement. Well, let's say all over the world, mostly in the West, but it had some reflections also in the then Soviet Union. And myself, with a few active students, said, of course, nuclear weapons are based on physics, and maybe it's our task to better understand how these work and how the carrier systems, let's say missiles and bombers, etc., cruise missiles, how they work. And is it really true, or are there good reasons to argue against their deployment, in particular of the intermediate range missiles? Then in the discussion was the US Pershing II missile and the cruise missiles by the US. On the other hand, on the other side, there were the SS-20 intermediate range ballistic missiles that from the Soviet Union could reach Western Europe, for instance. And then we prepared a seminar on physics and armament, and we found a benevolent physics professor who kind of acted as an umbrella and gave us the opportunity, and he took part actively, and we had the first seminar on physics and armament in 1981 at the University of Marburg. And there was so much interest in the physics, mainly student, but also ready-made physicists, including professors Germany-wide, that we were asked, can't you publish the seminar talks in a kind of book? And so we produced a book like we did, the university department did manuscripts for practical exercises, just in a very little department workshop, printing shop. And the first print run of 500 copies, we collected ourselves by running around a table with 10 people and collecting one leaflet after the other and binding them together and gluing them, etc., just by all voluntary work. So the 500 things we just sold for the paper price of 6 Deutschmarks then, and they were sold out widely over the whole German Federal Republic after a few weeks. And so we were encouraged to make a second print run, which was then already a little bit more professional with 1,500 copies. And then another physics student organization, so to speak, the so-called Fachschaft at the University of Karlsruhe, without asking us, just did a kind of illegal reprint of that thing, another 1,500 copies. And they were also sold out, and our 1,500 as well. So we then decided we have to do it on a much larger scale. And then we collected loans from some physics professors. I myself had a job as a scientific staff member, a normally well-paid job, what we call a full post. But I think we needed something like 12,000 Deutschmarks to finish professional print shop and binding shop for, I think it was kind of, I'm not sure, was it 8,000 or 10,000 copies? I'm not sure, maybe 8,000. So we managed to organize the 12,000 Deutschmarks to have this professionally printed and bound. And then one of the students, again, completely voluntary, without any remuneration, took it on himself to take in the orders and mail these things out as packages to the various universities. And these 8,000 were also sold out, nearly sold out within a year or so. So there was a very big interest in the physics community, not just students, but also teaching personnel in the universities. And I guess you will find our book, Physics and Disarmament, then the somewhat modern yellow binding version in many university libraries and also physics department libraries still. So that was a long story about how we had success in making ourselves more knowledgeable in physics and armament. And this was not just about nuclear weapons and nuclear carriers. We took the opportunity to include other more modern aspects. So for instance, ballistic missile defense. Let's see, so there are 12 or 13 chapters which kind of demonstrate that physics has not only been used for modern military technology, but in those times, early 1980s, was continued to be used for actual new military technologies. And I can add that this is the same is the case today and will remain for quite some time if humankind does not find a way to limit military technological progress, but I guess we'll come to that later. So this was from 1981 to say 1983 when the third big printing appeared, and my contract there ended 1984. And so I had the problem, find a job for yourself afterwards and to be able to earn some money. And then, by a lucky chance, a fellowship program came around, organized by the Volkswagen Foundation. This is a science funding foundation. It's nothing to do with the Volkswagen Corporation. It just was a foundation installed with some money, which came, well, it's a long story, maybe I shouldn't tell it all, from the former what is it, stock market value of the Volkswagen Corporation, etc. So it is a science funding foundation, and some peace researcher and strategic researcher had contacted them and asked, we have too few or too little disarmament related and arms control related research in Germany. Can't we do something about it? And they put up a first testing fellowship program just for fellowships for 1 year to instigate more people to enter arms control and disarmament research. And they, in particular, encouraged people from non-political sciences to apply. And two of the seminar group from University of Marburg, my colleague Jürgen Scheffran and myself, applied for fellowships and were granted them immediately. So each of us had 1 year of stipend of fellowship to look into some physics-based question of actual military technology. Jürgen Scheffran looked at anti-satellite developments, and I looked at laser weapons in space. After that year came near to its end, the Volkswagen Foundation said, we like what you do, why don't you ask for another fellowship? And I for one, I think I got a 2 years fellowship under the auspices of the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt, or HSFK, Hessische Stiftung Friedens- und Konfliktforschung in German, and Frankfurt Main. They applied at the VW Foundation in mutual coordination, and the VW Foundation granted them the money for hiring me. And so I was hired from 1986 to 1988 at this Peace Research Institute, which still is the biggest peace research institute in Germany by now, with some 60 or so people. And I worked in the arms control research group there, directed by Gerd Krell, a political science researcher who by now, of course, is long retired. And I did my physics-based research on ballistic missile developments that might be used in Europe, kind of small model of what is so-called Strategic Defense Initiative, inaugurated by then US President Reagan in March 1983. So what would following such a road in Europe or in Germany mean, and would that be good or bad for world peace and stability in Europe? And so I did this 2 years project and did a technical, mostly technical, but also somewhat interdisciplinary study. The title was then SDI for Europe, and then a subtitle, something about properties and problems with anti-tactical ballistic missile defenses. And up to now, I think it's being used for people who in the natural science worldwide want to enter the field of ballistic missile defense and want to understand the formulas that hold there and the technical arguments. Okay, that was by 1988. And again, I was encouraged by the VW Foundation to apply at some university for a longer range project, maybe with a little research group. And such groups were also there was encouragement also at the Technical University of Darmstadt, where similar seminars had been held under the informal leadership of then Professor Egbert Kankeleit, and several kind of my generation young physicists who still are important in this area. One is Wolfgang Liebert at the Boku University in Vienna. Another one is Jürgen Scheffran, already mentioned, who is now at the University of Hamburg. And let's see who else. No, I think that these are the most relevant of the first generation in Darmstadt. And so more or less simultaneously in 1988. And I forgot, in Hamburg, there was also an active physics professor, Hartwig Spitzer, who, being very old, still is active in this area. So 3 research groups were funded by the Volkswagen Foundation for a couple of years, usually for 3 years with the possibility of prolonging by further 2 years. And I had to look out for a university that would be interested in applying for this research group and this money. And again, there was a benevolent physics professor whom I knew from the scientist peace movement, Bernhard Gonsior, at the university at Bochum, Universität Bochum, who, when asked, would you sign such an application for me? He said, yes, of course. And just by chance, simultaneously, the Ruhr University had decided to found a new institute for international humanitarian law and peacekeeping law, a law institute dealing with, on one hand, the laws of warfare, on the other hand, the laws of peace, disarmament and peacekeeping, etc. And again, by chance, the founding director of that institute was the rector of the university at that time. So then the application to the Volkswagen Foundation was sent by the Ruhr University at its highest level, with some research money on the one hand for that law institute and for the physics working group that I should found there on the other hand. And this was granted, and from spring 1988 on, I worked there. So coming back to your original question, what brought me into the disarmament field, it was that first seminar in Marburg. And then when I, after my 5 years in Marburg, had to think about where do I find a job, I applied at 1 or 2 industry firms, but I also asked myself, there are a few colleagues in the US, such as Richard Garvin and Hans Bethe and other famous figures who had published articles about the futility of ballistic missile defense already in the late 1968, when we had this discussion internationally and in particular in the US. And there was a colleague, Costa Tsipes from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who had written Scientific American article about how do cruise missiles work, modern ones, etc. And there were a few others where I saw that scientists can play a useful role in understanding modern military technology and explaining them to the public, not only just how they work, but also are there dangers connected to them, and should one do something about them? And I asked myself, it can't be a law of nature that such articles can only be written in the US. Why shouldn't we have similar things here? And we had started kind of teaching ourselves in the seminar with literature coming from the US colleagues, among others. And then came this fellowship program, which was such an offer, and I had no problems. I needed not pay for, or earn money for family. My wife, also a physicist, had a good job, which was not quite permanent, but developed into that. And so I had no real reason to just take any job that would give me outlook for a year, a full life of paid work. But I had kind of the freedom to choose what I really found interesting and important. And so I applied at that fellowship. And as I told you, by twice prolongation and then funding the little research group at Ruhr Universität Bochum, I got the chance to really do professional paid work in this area. Okay, that was the first answer.
Yeah, very interesting way and career. So before we go deeper into the details of nanotechnology and autonomous weapon systems, you mentioned earlier the link between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. So this is also a very important topic in the sense that, for example, the community, not only the scientific community, but also the public is divided. One group are telling us that, okay, nuclear energy is green and, it's sustainable on the one hand, and then you have another group that advocating for stopping or banning the nuclear energy facilities and so on and so forth. So, and there is this dangerous thing. We see it not only in Iran nowadays, that from gaining nuclear power plants and energy, you can produce nuclear weapons. So what's your stand, before we go deeper into your research field, what's your stand on this nuclear energy debate?
At first, one has to understand that the material that one uses in reactors and nuclear energy reactors, uranium-235, is the same material that has been used in the very first nuclear bomb ignited in Hiroshima on 6th August 1945, and that there is a difference just in the degree of enrichment. So while in natural uranium-235 is just 0.7%, all the rest, nearly all the rest is uranium-238, which cannot really be used in reactors and also not in bombs. But in reactors, it has to be enriched to something like 3 to 5%, whereas for bombs, it usually is being enriched to 90%. In the Hiroshima bomb, that was the very first sample, it was 80%. So the material is the same. And so any country that commands enrichment facilities has the principal possibility to produce either energy material with 5%, 3 to 5% uranium-235, or 80 or 90% for weapons. And it is for this inborn kind of natural law vicinity between both that there is a kind of ambiguity if a country has nuclear energy installations, in particular enrichment facilities, but also reprocessing facilities. We could go into details if you ask for it. But, and so for this reason, there is the International Atomic Energy Agency that has the right to check the civilian nuclear facilities in the countries who have signed safeguards agreement with this agency and who are members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And this is very important, and in principle, it could be used to separate purely civilian use from use for military, for nuclear weapons. In the future, fusion reactors should be included into such safeguards and monitoring as well. But at the moment, it's mainly about so-called fissionable materials, in particular uranium-235, and just to have mentioned it, plutonium-239, which is being produced from uranium-238, which is still the majority of the uranium in nuclear reactors. And separating this and gaining access to plutonium-239 for weapons, that's exactly the task of reprocessing facilities that I just mentioned. So in principle, if the states comply with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and accept inspections and permanent monitoring by installed cameras, etc., by the International Atomic Energy Agency, this separation is possible. Problems arise if some country doesn't allow such monitoring activities. We had problems with North Korea, and there were certain indications of problems with Iran while they still had this monitoring. And there was a solution with the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, with very stringent obligations for Iran and its enrichment, etc. And unfortunately, that had been, the US had gone out of that agreement under President Trump, and President Biden now has problems getting the US in and getting Iran in again. And the European Union had tried to keep the agreement going, etc. It's a very difficult process at the moment. It's still not yet valid again. It was signed in 2015, and I think when did Trump leave the US leave the agreement? Maybe 2020. I'm not sure. Okay, so in principle it could be separated, but there is this natural connection.
And
now,
also,
yeah.
And also, we should mention maybe the extraction from uranium is also. Let me state it quite simple. It's a dirty thing in the true sense of the meaning, because it's extracted from countries like Nigeria, Namibia, South Africa, and they are creating up to 18% of world's annual production. And as we know, some of these governments are corrupt, and it could be, it goes in hands of smugglers and so on and so forth. So also the extraction of making nuclear energy the extraction from uranium is also quite dangerous. Would you agree on that?
There's a general danger of radioactivity, but the radioactive materials are also being used in hospitals, etc. So that can't be a general argument to not use things that are radioactive. It's rather a question of cautionary measures and regulation, how you protect yourself, etc. But in this context, one has to state that the uranium produced in Sachsen, in the former German Democratic Republic, was mainly used for Soviet nuclear weapons. And it was produced by the miners under very dangerous conditions. They inhaled radioactive substances, and many of them suffered from lung cancer and other cancers. So the history of the mining for uranium ore is full of sad stories of sickened miners, etc., etc. So this is one of the disadvantages connected with nuclear energy from uranium, or indirectly from plutonium. There's another aspect, coming back again to your question, is the final depositing of what remains after burning the 3% of uranium-2 or 5% of uranium-235 in fuel elements in nuclear energy reactors. The remains remain highly radioactive with half times of tens of thousands of years. So one has to make sure that they remain separate from the environment and can't reach humans or whatever animals over many millennia, hundreds of thousands of years maybe. And so this is why, except for one country, Finland, who's just now opening its first underground repository, all other countries are struggling with how to make sure that they keep these highly radioactive materials safe for such a long geologic time, so to speak. So that's another general disadvantage. And one could point to several big accidents where reactors nearly blew up or actually blew up. Harrisburg in the US and Fukushima in Japan. And of course, in 1986, a couple of years, 15 years before, in help me, Ukraine, Chernobyl. So all this together was the set of arguments that led then Chancellor Angela Merkel in Germany to that decision that nuclear energy should be phased out in Germany. And just now, this year, the final 4 nuclear power stations are to be switched off. There's some discussion if in the context of the energy crisis, the gas and oil crisis and coal crisis, maybe that one has in the wake of the war of aggression of Russia against the Ukraine, whether they should run a bit longer, but it looks like people will rather argue for strengthening activities in the direction of regenerative energies and house insulation and saving energy and so on. Instead, and maybe running a few coal plants a little longer, but not reactivating or continuing running nuclear power stations. This is, of course, in Germany, and this is quite different from what is going on in France. So the general discussion about the utility or disadvantages of nuclear energy is a very long topic, and it's not my real specialty. Maybe you find some colleague who is better equipped to go into more detail.
Now, before we go deeper into nanotechnology and autonomous weapon systems, I'm very curious. I believe you mentioned it in one presentation, in one lecture. So let's outlet the theory, maybe prisma, maybe we should call it ideology, that lies behind this technological development. I'm referring to the just war theory, or maybe we should call it just war doctrine. So in what kind of sense, in what kind of political era we can understand better this technological development? What is the underlying, so to speak, social theory or ethics behind this new development?
I think it's just kind of normal continuation of what has gone on for probably a century or more. That is, countries prepare for war. They have armed forces, and countries can attack others and can be aggressive. And so they have forces, at least for defense, but usually up to, let's say, 1919, foundation of the League of Nations, or maybe 1945, the founding of the United Nations. Before that, it was a normal part of statehood that states have an armed force, and that it is normal if they want to grab a province from a neighbor, maybe because there's oil or because there's coal or iron ore, whatever, or has very fertile soil. So it was just normal to invade the country, attack it, and try to get hold of that province or of that industry, whatever. This was kind of the normal state of affairs. But then at the latest, I think with the Charter of the United Nations, 1945, nations agreed that it is forbidden to use force against another country and to threaten force against another country. And because similar things had already been written in the Statute of the League of Nations, 1919, and it hadn't held. Of course, we had not just World War I, but then unfortunately also World War II. They tried to build somewhat more safety and security mechanisms into the Charter of the United Nations. And now it is forbidden to attack other countries. And if nevertheless it would occur, the Charter foresees the action by the Security Council. The Security Council of the United Nations has been founded just for that purpose. And if you read the Charter, you find it to maintain peace and international security. And if there is a peace breaker, a violator, to do something about it. This could be all kinds of things. This could be diplomatic means. This could be the attempt to get jurisdiction by an international court, or to have economic sanctions but also military sanctions. And only if such, let's start again. Only if a country is being attacked, it should address itself to the Security Council, and the Security Council should decide what to do and help it and drive back the aggression. Unfortunately, and if such a case, in such a case of aggression, the Security Council mechanisms do not work, only then legally, that's the famous Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, is it allowed for a country to use force in self-defense, either itself alone or collective self-defense. And this Article 51 is the kind of legal justification, but provides also a kind of moral justification for countries to still have armed forces. But formally, and on the argument side, or as people say, so to speak, just for defense. And for this reason, by the way, this is what I teach students in my lectures, in introductory lectures on the international system. Many countries have changed the names of their industries from Ministry or Department of War to Ministry of Defense or Defense Department, just to be in line with the wording of and the meaning of the Charter of the United Nations. So that's the kind of superficial level why countries still have armed forces, while it is still forbidden to attack other countries. And now, as we know, the Security Council does not always function, or does very rarely function in that role, because of the veto powers of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And so we have had so many wars since 1945 that should have been stopped by the Security Council, but because this or that permanent member was involved on one side or the other, or was kind of friendly to a warring side, the Security Council did not fulfill its role that was written in the United Nations Charter. By the way, several of the other mechanisms in Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, namely the foundation of a committee of military commanders to help in military action commanded by the Security Council, and the providing of Air Force contingents by countries to the United Nations for such military sanctions have never been fulfilled. So we have empty paragraphs here that stand there and nobody cares about them and nobody acts according to them. Unfortunately, I think if one wants to revitalize the main function of the United Nations, these regulations, the paragraphs of Chapter 7 could play an important role. And of course, the changing the veto power of the veto power of permanent members need also to be changed if one wants to have the Security Council fulfill its role. But that's a very difficult political question. So where is the ethics here? The ethics is in having armed forces on the surface only for defense. But of course, what exactly is defense in certain situations is somewhat open to interpretation, and you can fake an attack against yourself and then act in quotes defense, etc., etc. So it's a difficult issue. The just war doctrine that you cite is used also for an argument for keeping armed forces, but relatively rarely, mainly by people who care about world peace, but also about justice and injustice in the world, etc. So they see, and some argue that in case to prevent very ugly mass violations of human rights, of mass killings, etc. We had them in many places, Rwanda, etc. Then it would be sensible and ethically not only justified, but also you would be obliged to ethically to invade and stop such aggressive murdering, etc. So in this sense, one could argue from just war theory or just war doctrine that keeping armed forces just for such a purpose can be justified. Again, that's a long discussion, and I have taken part in a big project by the Protestant Church of Germany about what would, how can one combine justice and peace. Just peace is the key word here, and one can find some argument for military action in such an extraordinary case. However, if one has the armed forces for such purposes, they could also be used for other purposes, for aggressive ones against neighbors, or maybe not so far, not so close neighbors by long distance weapons. And so the principal possibility of being attacked by another country still exists. And now comes the next topic from the political science, that's the so-called security dilemma. We, in civilized and in particular democratic countries, we have such an organization that there is a monopoly of legal violence with the state. You as a citizen must not use violence or violent force against anybody else in the country. And in many civilized countries, some exceptions exist, such as the US, but in many civilized countries, you are even prohibited from having weapons. You may have to apply for a special license for a sport weapon or for a hunting weapon, and not everybody runs around with a pistol in the belt. As I said, there are other countries which see this somewhat differently, which could also be called civilized in a certain sense, but generally it is the overarching authority of the state in democratic countries justified by the electorate to decide on what weapons people should have or can have, and under what conditions exceptions could be granted, let's say to police people. And so in principle, let's say in Western Europe, you as a citizen, and also Eastern Europe for that matter, you can, as a citizen, be relatively sure that not everybody that you meet on the road will carry a weapon and will like to shoot at you, so that in order to protect yourself, you should have a gun yourself and shoot first, so to speak. So this is the condition that we have within countries with an authority with legitimate use of violence, a monopoly of such violence. And the state has the means, not only the rules, but also the means to enforce compliance with such rules, which weapons you can have or must not have, for those to enforce compliance from those who do not like these prohibitions. So there's a gun regulation in many countries, and those who nevertheless illegally try to get guns and rob banks, etc., they are being prosecuted by police, they are being put to court, and if found guilty, they are put into jail, etc. Long story, short sentence. This is the situation within societies with this monopoly of legitimate violence and the possibility to decide what citizens can have with respect to guns. No such situation in the international system. At the base of it, we still have a state of anarchy. States cannot rely, as I said in this case, also on the mechanisms of the UN Charter and the UN Security Council to protect them from aggression. No, in principle, other countries could attack some country. And so there is armed forces to defend against such potential aggression. This is the case for more or less all countries. So they keep armed forces. And if you do not take special measures to structure them mostly defensively, they usually, in order to have them actively and effectively combating in the defense role, they also could work offensively. And so if we look at the international system from above, we see many actors who try to make themselves secure by keeping up armed forces to defend themselves, but at the same time increasing the threat against others, neighbors and not so close neighbors, by this weapons with over a long range. And so in the effort to make themselves secure against aggression, they as a whole increase the possibility of aggression and the threat against each other. That's a security dilemma. The dilemma is you want to make yourself secure, but in the interaction with all other actors, you get a situation where you are more insecure. So that's the security dilemma. And this then is the general property of the international system as we have it now. And political science does think about what could be done to ease, to make the security dilemma less difficult, and maybe even to stop it. One very general possibility to stop it would be kind of a world federation, a world government that could, with the monopoly of legitimate violence and democratically elected, could decide on rules what states can have as weapons, and could decide what they must not have, and could go into some state that does not comply to these rules, as I said in the example of this within society. But this is, of course, far off and would take a very long political process and a very long process of raising consciousness in whole humankind, etc. There are a couple of possibilities how one could solve the security dilemma before such a situation. The relatively easy one is to mutually limit in an agreed form what one has as armaments. And we have seen this with the nuclear weapons limitations coming about in the Cold War. SALT I, SALT II agreements, START Treaty and New START Treaty, and then Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, etc. So that is the fairly easy thing to do, but nevertheless, it meets resistance. It meets resistance within the respective countries, at first in the military forces. Of course, they still are there, they exist, and their task is, should it come to armed conflict, they should be victorious. They should prevail over the enemy. And of course, the more you limit what they can have, the less effective they can fight. So it needed the experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 for the two main actors of the nuclear arms race then, that was in 1962, to understand that they are on a very dangerous path with unlimited build-up of nuclear weapons and new carriers, etc., etc. And this then led to the very first arms control treaty, the partial nuclear test ban treaty, just a year later, which did not need much verification. We can discuss it if you wish. And then 9 years later, we had the strategic arms limitation talks and the SALT I, and again, 7 years later, 1979, this SALT II agreement, and then 1991, START I, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. So the arms control or mutually agreed limitation of what one can have in arms, and maybe also in armed forces and person power in the armed forces, is a way that has demonstrably already been gone to limit the security dilemma and produce kind of a more secure situation. Okay, again, relatively long story about ethics and politics in the international system.
Yeah, so we outline the theories behind it and the political concepts behind it. And one example for this security dilemma, and that is that the security dilemma is still important, is as you mentioned, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And unfortunately, the US, the big powers, and Russia did not comply with this treaty, and it expires. And another thing that is quite important is that there are criteria. For example, the jus ad bellum, the right to go to war, as you mentioned, and there is this jus in bello, so the right conduct in war. So, and now this is also important when we are talking about nanotechnology, when we are talking about autonomous weapon systems, when we are talking about nuclear missiles, and so on and so forth. It all has to do with one important term or one important concept, a key concept that is also a part of the UN Charter. It's called proportionality. So you always have to keep in mind that your measures have to be proportional to the outcome. So you cannot bomb a state that threatens you with nuclear forces without any good reason behind it. So it always, yeah, you have to keep in mind this proportionality. So yeah, this is so to speak the theory behind it. So now let's dig deeper into the nanotechnology.
Let me just add a little remark. I'm not sure whether the rule of proportionality is part of the UN Charter. I don't recall having read it there. It's part of the so-called international humanitarian law, or the international law of warfare. That's exactly what you mentioned, the jus in bello, the rules, how armed forces can behave or must not behave when they are already at war. And just to repeat the three basic tenets there, one is combatants can be fought against. You can shoot them, whatever, but you cannot act against non-combatants. These are not only civilians, just people, but also civilian objects, but these are also combatants who are out of hors de combat, or who have been injured, etc. So that is the major rule. You must not attack non-military targets. The second rule, and yes, and there is kind of a rule of military necessity. You cannot use too much force. You have to kind of use what is necessary to fulfill or to achieve the respective military goals that you have set yourself. Conquer this hill, or invade this province, etc. And the second major rule is whenever an attack against a legitimate military target may produce injuries or damages to civilian persons or civilian objects, then the amount of such so-called collateral damage must not be excessive compared to the military success that you want to achieve. So I think the proportionality is in this sense limited to the law of warfare. And of course, in internal security forces, the police has a much stricter rule of proportionality, shooting only when your life is threatened as a police person or somebody else's in your vicinity. Otherwise, you use whatever, the baton or tear gas or what have you. Okay, now back to the concrete terms.
So my next question is, how are nanotechnology and autonomous weapon systems used in war? Let's begin in general, and then maybe we can go specific to the Ukraine war.
Well, honestly, nanotechnology is nearly not yet being used at all in war. There is, let's say, one exception. The usual definition of nanotechnology is these are systems where components, at least in one dimension, have sizes between 0.1 nanometer or maybe 1 nanometer and 100 nanometers. And this applies since 10 or so years to computer chips where the structure sizes has been decreased from, let's say, 200 or more nanometers in the 70s to by now then to 45 nanometers, maybe 10 years ago, and to something like 10 nanometers by now. So there is nanotechnology in all modern military weapons and other communication systems in the form of the computer chips and memory chips that are built in there, but not much more. I have written a book on potential military applications of nanotechnology, and one other application could have been or could be the building of composites of nanofibers, where the fibers themselves are not micrometers like the normal carbon fibers in material for aircraft, but where they would have a few nanometers diameter, and they could be much stronger such materials and more lightweight than the traditional ones. But I'm not aware, outside of lab specimens and some testing and so on, that any nanofiber-based composites is being used routinely, neither in military nor in civilian systems. And similar things hold for several other applications that I predicted or kind of assessed that they might become possible. The book was published in 2006, in 5 years, in 10 years, or in 20 years. So it's still in the research stage, also for military applications mostly, and maybe in some in development and testing stage. I wrote update in, let's see, I think 2017, where I reviewed my old, well, I don't call them predictions, but assessments of the potential arrival times of certain systems. And in most cases, they proved more or less valid still a couple of years ago, as in 2005, 2006. In some cases, I had to postpone the expected arrival times by a couple of years. So, as I said, the main nanotechnology used in the military is in the form of computer components. Coming to autonomous weapon systems, it depends how one defines what this is. And I follow a definition that has been given by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And this is a very rare instance where I agree with what the Defense Department in the United States says. So its definition is quite similar. They say autonomous weapon system is one that after activation selects targets and attacks them, engages them is the wording, without further human input. And now, this is a fairly general technical definition. And if you look at defensive systems with an autonomous mode, there's the Patriot anti-aircraft and anti-missile, which has an automatic mode. So the operators who are just at the place where the things are being launched and where the radar detects incoming missiles or aircraft, they can decide we will not be able to launch each of the 4 or 8 missiles that I have available at the moment by hand. I just switch the whole thing to automatic. And then, of course, the thing is activated. The radar measures the incoming trajectory of the missile and then decides where the counter missile needs to be steered at to meet the other thing and hit it with a shrapnel when they meet by just a few meters distance. So in the general sense, you could say this is selecting targets and engaging targets without further human input. But nevertheless, and similar things hold for automatic radar-controlled ship cannons, such as phalanx, that have to shoot at high sequence, 1,000 per minute cartridges against incoming sea-skimming missiles, where human reaction would be just too slow to actually follow the target with the bore of the gun, etc., etc. So these systems kind of decide autonomously, but in a very narrow setting, under very narrow circumstances, where there's not much other traffic around, etc. So some people call these automatic rather than autonomous. I would say in this general definition of autonomy, they have to be called autonomous in a certain sense, but nevertheless, they are not the ones that create the problems. The ones that would create problems would be those that you send out as an armed force and that they roam in a certain area, look out where is something that looks like an enemy system, an enemy person, and then decide to attack this one and attack it. These are, of course, autonomous systems in the full sense of the word. And if one wants to prohibit those, but leave allowed the short-range last-second defense systems that I just mentioned, then they would have to be named an exception from the prohibition. So now, do these autonomous weapon systems already exist, are being used in war? Yes, these short-range last-minute defense systems, yes, and I have said why I see them as a kind of exception. But the other ones that can roam an area for hours and search for target do not really exist yet, with some exception. There's an Israeli anti-radar drone, Harpy. It has been around since 15 or so years, and it could roam for half an hour. I think by now it's many hours, and listen electronically for radar emission. And whenever it detects radar signals hitting it, then it looks up in some database, are these friendly ones or are these enemy ones? And if it's detected and recognized and classified as enemy, then it flies into that antenna and explodes there. So this is an autonomous weapon systems in the full sense of the word, but directed at a very set of targets. Were these expanded to look out not just for radar signals that send active electromagnetic waves, but also for the images of tanks, of military trucks, of single soldiers, etc., they would be the autonomous system in the general sense, as I explained just a few minutes ago. And these systems we do not yet have. Again, there are some indications that in the Libyan war 2020, some Turkish mini drones might have been used in such an autonomous targeting and attacking mode. And maybe some Russian systems may have been used in the Ukraine war earlier this year. So we are kind of on the verge of their introduction, and there is only very little time left if humankind finds this development dangerous and would like to rather stay alive without these being introduced widely to solve the problem of a prohibition. I'm not sure whether you want to ask for that, but the outlook for that at the moment is not very good.
How does the system decide who is a combatant and a soldier, a dangerous or maybe a terrorist, and who is a civilian, who is a normal person? What is the criteria? How does the system recognize those differences? In my opinion, it's rather like the film Terminator with Arnold Schwarzenegger. For me, it sounds like a dystopia. But yeah, I'm not I'm not into this field, so yeah, I do not understand it quite well. But yeah, in my opinion, it's quite dangerous to let the machine decide who is the good guy and who is the bad guy.
I agree to your last sentence, but let me just again start with a certain remark. I hesitate using the Terminator comparison. This was a kind of super intelligent system. I have only seen, I think, the first sequence, and we are far from such systems, which by themselves would develop ugly behavior and destroy kind of arbitrarily, etc. What is upon us are computer-controlled weapon systems that use certain human-produced and programmed algorithms to find targets, classify them, select them for attacking and attacking them. And who would program, who would write these programs? Well, that's software engineers that as they develop other software for military systems. And of course, there are already quite capable assistance systems in modern combat aircraft, so that the pilot is freed to really care about the actual combat situation and not about the details, which target should be attacked first, which is closest, which is most dangerous, which comes fastest, etc., etc. So there are already kind of precursors, but up to now, the final decision to shoot either with a projectile or with a missile rests with the pilot in this case, or with a human operator on the ground, even for a remotely controlled drone. So the software engineers will face the big problems if they are to be designing autonomous weapon systems, to set themselves or to put themselves in the shoes, if you wish, of the video system and devise algorithms that reliably enough do exactly the classification that you asked about. This is a soldier, this is a non-combatant, this can be attacked, that one must not. Or this is a civilian system and that is a military system. Or if there's a civilian system right beside a military system, to do the proportionality calculation. Is the expected damage to the civilian installation excessive if compared to the achieved military goal? And this is a very, very difficult program issue. There may be so many influencing factors that you try, of course, you try your best, and you have hundreds of persons working on the system and competing teams, etc. And you will have trials at first in software and then on training grounds with actual testing samples of such weapons. You will test them and you will discover so many flaws in the software, so many false detections and classifications. There may be a sandstorm and so on, and you may be able to build in precautions against all the errors that you might have found out in testing in software or in hardware. However, the events in war cannot be predicted. There's the famous fog of war in C. Clausewitz's famous statement or famous book. The environment can differ from what has been put into the program. And in particular, the enemy action may be very different from what you or your red team may have come up with. And of course, every armed force will try to build in as many surprises as possible to make dysfunctional the enemy autonomous systems. So we cannot be sure that autonomous weapon systems will be able to comply with the international humanitarian law, with the law of warfare, as a human would when he or she had time to look at the situation and think about the ramifications, etc. Problem is that with the developments that we can observe already now and which will accelerate with the introduction of autonomous weapon systems, there may come a situation where decisions about attacking or not attacking may have to be taken within a second or so, maybe even in a tenth of a second. If you think of cyber attack and automated cyber reaction to save your internet connections and your military networks, etc. So I cannot foresee a situation where in a complex battle situation, an autonomous weapon systems would be able to judge on a situation at the level of an experienced human commander. We observed so many difficulties in what one calls artificial intelligence. Usually, the human is very good in jumping out of the system, thinking laterally, thinking about ramifications, seeing the system as a model from above, thinking about consequences on the political side, whatever. And of course, in principle, you might be able to program all this, but this will take decades and maybe dozens of bloody wars with illegal decisions by autonomous weapon systems, because the war will behave or will develop differently than what you will have tested. So in a sense, as we see it in civilian software, the final development of the product will be sourced out to the customers, which is not okay in civilian life when we have to suffer through all the flaws that are in the operating systems or in new versions of the commercial software. But it is really deadly in the verbatim sense of the word if the product is an autonomous weapon systems or fleets of autonomous weapon systems and experiences with actually illegally killed civilians and destroyed schools and wedding parties, etc. Only these would need to improvements of the software. So I think the responsible thing to do is to prohibit such systems at the outset. As I said, politically at the moment, there are a couple important militarily strong countries who would not like such a prohibition and who are against it. And in particular in the CCW convention, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons that are deemed to cause superfluous damage or who cannot be used discriminately. That's the about title. In the discussions in that context among the parties to that convention, many relevant countries are members. The discussions or the decisions are usually taken by consensus. So just one of the 125 member states of that are capable to stop the process towards the prohibition that under this framework convention, and we have rather like 10 or so countries, militarily strong countries, who do not want even a negotiating mandate for such a prohibition.
So let me sum up. One might argue that this autonomous weapon systems and drones are very precise, and one can argue that with this kind of warfare, you kind of prevent war crimes, rape, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, you have this danger, the risk that when two autonomous weapon systems clash at each other, so for example, it could lead to a series of escalation, because one system detects this as a kind of aggression, then the system reacts and the other system reacts to this reaction, and so on and so forth. So we have this series of escalation. So yeah, we have this kind of debate that is still going on. Yeah, it's kind of not decided yet. So to sum up and to finally make a case for or against gun laws or arm controls, how should we think about this development? Should we abolish these systems entirely, or should we make stronger or stricter arm controls? What's your opinion? What's your take on that?
I think autonomous weapon systems, with the exceptions that I mentioned, need to be prohibited at the outset and more or less completely. That's not only because of the compliance with the law of warfare, but also, as you said, and I thank you for that hint, the escalation potential that comes from autonomous weapon systems that in a crisis situation need to decide very fast, and by some false alarm they could start shooting even if the state that is behind does not really want it politically at the moment. So yes, this danger is much undervalued in the international discussion, partly because this convention that I mentioned is about the behavior in war, but there should be also the arguments should be better understood about international stability and escalation risk that should lead to a prohibition of autonomous shooting and autonomous systems.
Yeah, and who spend the most for military research, nanotechnology research, and yeah, for the military-industrial complex? Which country does spend the most?
I have studied it fairly intensely and written a book chapter on that. Of the worldwide expenditure for military research and development, the US carries about 2/3, 63 or 60%. This varies from year to year, and it's on the order of $70 or so billion per year, more than the total defense expenditure in Germany, for instance, per year.
So one might think that the US is in heavy danger, because when we go back to the proportionality concept, then one might think that they are under constant pressure and heavy danger. But okay, let's do not be cynical about this.
We could just continue at another time. I think the main problem is that the US wants military technological superiority, and that needs to be tackled. That problem needs to be changed.
So, dear Jürgen Altmann, I thank you very much for having you on this program. It was an honor and pleasure talking to you, and maybe we can continue another time about taking more time about the Russian artillery systems that are used now in the Ukraine, and about the geopolitics that is going on. Yeah, thank you very much for this talk.
Yeah, you're welcome. Maybe next time. Yes, I agree to it. Yes.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day yourself. Bye.